Sometimes an investigation changes because of a dramatic confession. Other times it changes because of a single decision made before the first real question is even asked. According to public reporting surrounding the investigation, federal authorities eventually interviewed Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law as they worked to piece together the events surrounding her disappearance. What happened inside that interview has become a major point of public interest, but it's important to separate verified information from speculation. For investigators, interviews are rarely about getting someone to confess immediately. They're often about understanding a person's version of events in detail, then comparing that account with phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, and other evidence gathered throughout the investigation. That process is what makes interviews so important. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had already captured national attention. Family members were searching for answers. Law enforcement agencies were coordinating their efforts. Every new development was being closely watched by the public. When investigators spoke with people close to Nancy, they weren't looking only for dramatic moments. They were trying to build a timeline: who saw her, when they saw her, where they were, and whether those accounts matched the physical and digital evidence. As investigators know, even small inconsistencies can become significant. Sometimes a timeline holds together, sometimes it doesn't. And that's where this story begins. According to investigators' public statements, Nancy was last seen during what initially appeared to be an ordinary evening. There was nothing that immediately suggested the case would grow into one of the most closely followed investigations in the country. But as more evidence was collected, investigators continued examining every interaction, every phone call, every movement, and every statement connected to the case. That careful process, not dramatic confrontation, is often what determines whether an investigation moves forward. Over the coming months, authorities would compare interviews with forensic evidence, digital records, and witness accounts. Each new piece of information had to fit into the broader timeline. The central question remained the same: did every account accurately reflect what happened that night? That question would shape the investigation moving forward. And as investigators continued reviewing the evidence, they reportedly began focusing on areas where timelines, communications, and physical evidence needed closer examination. Those developments would become some of the most closely watched aspects of the case, and they would raise even more questions about what really happened during Nancy Guthrie's final known hours. By the time federal investigators began comparing interview statements with the evidence they had collected, the case had already become far more complicated than it first appeared. An interview, by itself, rarely solves a major investigation. What matters is whether the account someone gives can withstand independent verification. Investigators typically compare every significant statement against phone records, surveillance footage, digital activity, financial transactions, vehicle movements, witness interviews, and forensic evidence. The goal isn't simply to catch someone in a lie. It's to determine whether the timeline being presented is consistent with everything else the investigation has uncovered. That process can take days, weeks, or even months. In Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators from multiple agencies worked to reconstruct her final known movements while examining every lead that might explain what happened after she disappeared. Publicly available information indicates that the investigation involved local law enforcement, the FBI, forensic specialists, and search teams operating across multiple locations. As investigators gathered additional evidence, they continued interviewing people who had been close to Nancy during the days leading up to her disappearance. That is standard practice. People may be interviewed more than once, especially if new evidence emerges or if investigators need clarification about specific details. Returning to a witness or family member does not, by itself, indicate wrongdoing. It often reflects the normal progression of a complex investigation. One of the most challenging aspects of any missing person investigation is building a reliable timeline. Every phone call, every text message, every vehicle movement, every surveillance camera, every witness account. Each piece becomes part of a much larger puzzle. Investigators aren't looking for dramatic moments. They're looking for consistency. If several independent sources support the same sequence of events, confidence in that timeline grows. If conflicts appear, investigators work to determine whether those differences result from innocent mistakes, fading memories, or something more significant. That careful process is why experienced investigators rarely rush to conclusions. Public speculation often moves much faster than evidence. Throughout the Nancy Guthrie investigation, online discussions produced countless theories. Social media users analyzed photographs, family relationships, public appearances, and statements from various individuals. Some believed they had already solved the case. Others urged patience while investigators continued their work. Law enforcement, however, follows a different standard. Investigators must be able to support every conclusion with evidence that can withstand scrutiny in court. That means separating facts from assumptions. It means testing every theory, even the ones that initially appear convincing. It also means following evidence wherever it leads, even if that evidence contradicts earlier assumptions. This is why interviews remain such an important investigative tool. They're not simply conversations. They're opportunities to compare a person's recollection with objective records gathered throughout the investigation. If those records support the account, investigators gain confidence in that version of events. If they don't, additional questions naturally follow. Publicly, authorities have remained careful about what they have disclosed throughout the investigation. While they have shared certain developments, they have also emphasized that protecting the integrity of the investigation requires withholding some information. That approach is common in major cases. Investigators sometimes keep key details confidential because only the person responsible, or someone with direct knowledge, would be expected to know them. Revealing every piece of evidence too early could compromise future interviews or legal proceedings. As the investigation continued, attention remained focused on one central objective: finding Nancy Guthrie. For her family, every passing day brought more uncertainty. For investigators, every new lead required careful examination. And for the public, the unanswered questions only continued to grow. What investigators ultimately needed wasn't speculation. It wasn't internet theories. It wasn't assumptions based on isolated details. They needed evidence that could explain what happened and, ultimately, withstand the legal standard required in court. Because in cases like this, the truth isn't determined by public opinion. It's established through evidence. And as investigators continued assembling that evidence, the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remained the foundation on which the entire case would eventually stand. By the end of the investigation's early stages, one thing had become clear: finding the truth would take more than interviews. Every answer investigators received had to be measured against physical evidence, digital records, forensic analysis, and witness testimony. That is how major investigations move forward, not through assumptions, but through verification. As public attention intensified, so did the speculation. Every new development generated another wave of theories online. Videos, social media posts, and discussion forums attempted to explain what had happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home and during the hours that followed her disappearance. Some theories appeared convincing. Others collapsed almost immediately when examined against the available facts. For investigators, none of that changed their mission. Their responsibility was never to confirm public opinion. It was to establish what could actually be proven. That distinction matters, because criminal investigations operate under a much higher standard than internet speculation. Detectives may develop working theories, but those theories must survive forensic testing, independent review, and, ultimately, legal scrutiny. Every timeline has to make sense. Every witness statement has to be evaluated. Every piece of digital evidence has to be authenticated. Only then can investigators determine whether the evidence supports criminal charges. Throughout the Nancy Guthrie investigation, law enforcement repeatedly emphasized that they were following the evidence wherever it led. That approach often requires patience, especially in complex cases involving forensic analysis, digital evidence, and multiple agencies working together. For Nancy's family, however, patience came with an enormous emotional cost. While investigators examined records and reconstructed timelines, the people who knew Nancy best continued living with uncertainty. Every unanswered question represented another day without knowing where their loved one was or what had happened to her. That reality is easy to lose sight of when a case dominates headlines. Behind every document, every interview, and every press conference is a family waiting for answers. It's also a reminder that investigators must balance two important responsibilities at the same time: pursuing justice and protecting the integrity of the investigation. Releasing information too early can compromise interviews, influence witness testimony, or affect future legal proceedings. Holding information back can frustrate the public, but in many investigations, it is necessary to preserve evidence that only the person responsible would know. That is why many major cases unfold slowly. The public often sees only a fraction of the evidence investigators are reviewing. Whether additional evidence ultimately strengthens the case, challenges earlier assumptions, or opens entirely new investigative paths depends on what can be verified, not what can be imagined. As this investigation continues to be examined, one lesson stands above the rest. Interviews are important. Timelines are important. Forensic evidence is important. But no single piece of evidence tells the entire story on its own. It is the combination of those pieces, tested, verified, and presented through the legal process, that determines what happened. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remains a deeply tragic case that has affected her family, her community, and everyone who has followed the investigation. The hope, both for investigators and for those who loved Nancy, is that every unanswered question will eventually receive an answer grounded in evidence. Because in the end, justice is not measured by the loudest theory. It is measured by the truth that can be proven. If you found this documentary informative and would like to see more carefully researched case breakdowns, consider subscribing to Crime Lens. And let us know in the comments, what part of the publicly available evidence do you think investigators considered most significant, and why?